What's up, you guys? For this episode, we're going to discuss Lincoln at Gettysburg, but we're not only going to discuss the Gettysburg Address by Abe Lincoln, we're also going to explore the Gettysburg Address by Edward Everett. You know, that kind of schlub that gave this 2-hour speech prior to Lincoln's Gettysburg Address? I actually read the whole thing by Edward Everett. So for this episode, I'm going to explore that particular address. It was 2 hours of information, while Lincoln's speech was 2 minutes. So we are going to explore Lincoln's speech as well, but we are going to give Edward Everett his due. This is the second episode in our two-part series on the awesomeness of Abe Lincoln. And we're going to explore what made him such a great leader. And a lot of you are probably saying like, oh my God, that's kind of like saying what makes Michael Jordan great at basketball. Well, duh. Why do we need, for my opinion, well, that's why you're listening to this episode of the RockneCast. So you can listen to what I have to think about Lincoln. And I think we all should think about the stakes and what occurred during the 1860s, because I think it also reveals something about the present day. So we all need to think about what made this union so great and what made Lincoln the greatest president of our union. I'm going to share with you one particular moment where Lincoln had absolute brass balls. So why am I exploring Edward Everett when this is really a President's Day podcast? Because I kind of have a soft spot for Edward Everett. Edward Everett is, for the most part, remembered in history as the guy who spoke before Lincoln, who was a little wordy. And no one really ever talks about what the hell his speech was about at the Gettysburg Address. And Lincoln is the one where I always say, oh, how brief and eloquent he was. But I'm going to give Edward Everett his due, because I read the whole thing. And there are some good parts to the speech, and there's even some good lines. For the most part, yeah, he's a little wordy, but he is kind of a guy after my own heart. You know, my friend Tom Karsner always says, hey, Rock, you're a little wordy, you're a little loquacious. So I kind of like these people that get a little wordy from time to time. And we're going to explore that because there is some really good stuff in that. But before we do that, we're going to sort of set the scene as why Gettysburg was so important, what happened at the Gettysburg Address, why they were convened there on November 19th, 1863, and really what the stakes were. This nation came incredibly close to losing the war, and it could have happened on multiple occasions. We were within a razor's edge of either out and out losing or a stalemate, where essentially we had a sort of de facto hostilities, cessation of hostilities like you see in North Korea and South Korea, where it would have been permanently divided and there would have been border skirmishes and it would have been essentially a stalemate. We were very close. Of course, that did not happen. If you go to the South, you do not need a passport. You can go in there and you can hang out. You can have as many grits as you want. And the American flag exists throughout the United States. But this great union of ours was preserved, and it was preserved largely in the summer of 1863, in which, one of those things where like you can't make this stuff up. Like the fact that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, two of our founders, died on the same date, July 4th, 1826. Well, the Union was saved in 1863 on July 4th, 1863, with two very significant incidents. July 4th was the day in which, in the western part of the United States, as it was then, Vicksburg surrendered in July 4th, 1863. And simultaneously, on July 4th, 1863, in the north, in Pennsylvania, in southern Pennsylvania, Robert E. Lee was on his way back after having been defeated at the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. And the battle itself ended July 3rd of 1863, but Lee was in retreat on those two dates. So yes, July 4th, 1863 the two most significant instances of the Civil War occurred on that date. And for the most part, after that, we pretty much knew we at least weren't gonna lose the war. The North was not gonna be invaded like that again. And the South, at that point, they were really holding out for a stalemate in which they could get weak-kneed politicians that would be elected, people like George McClellan, that were essentially wanted to cease hostilities in 1864 and allow the Union to essentially negotiate their way out of peace. So why do we want to explore the words of Edward Everett? Well, one, he is a contemporary source. He relied heavily on the notes of a professor who witnessed the battlefield. He gives the speech November 19th, 1863. So this is literally within months after the Battle of Gettysburg, which occurred between July 1st, 1863 and July 3rd of 1863. And Edward Everett is essentially recounting what the stakes were. And there's a lot of good stuff in here. So if you ever have an opportunity to read it, read the speech. I mean, it's not as good as Lincoln's. I mean, it's kind of like, he's kind of Scottie Pippen. Well, maybe that might be saying a little bit Scottie Pippen to Michael Jordan. It's a good speech. It's a little long. I think it also illustrates how Lincoln revolutionized the English language, because this kind of speech, Edward Everett was known as one of the greatest speakers of the mid-19th century, and he was the marquee speaker for this event. And they knew it was significant, and he was the one that was chosen. So this is a good sample of how people spoke at the time. And then if you juxtapose it with Lincoln's speech, which is just pure, undistilled brilliance, each word sparkles with clarity. A contemporary witness, and it's really cool if you ever get the chance in preparing for this podcast, you can actually listen on the internet to a guy who was 9 years old when the Gettysburg Address occurred, and he actually heard Lincoln speak, and Edward Everett. And this guy is named William Rathbone, Rathvon. He is from Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and you can actually hear him describe what he experienced at Gettysburg. How cool is that? And he describes Edward Everett's speech as sparkling in eloquence, which it really was. And you can see that even though it doesn't really jump off the page in terms of its written eloquence, it's a very long speech, it's very wordy. You can see how in a large group it would have been interesting to listen to. But then he refers to Lincoln as precision of thought, which of course very much it is the case. So in terms of Edward Everett, first of all, who the hell was Edward Everett? Like, why was he even chosen? And it's kind of funny when you hear about Edward Everett, as I've sort of come to understand him. Edward Everett is just always kind of the guy that spoke before Lincoln's speech. And people describe him as a great orator. They describe him as the featured speaker. And then they usually quote his famous line afterwards, is that after he gave this great speech, and then Lincoln does 2 minutes, everyone kind of instantly recognized that Lincoln's was the speech, and that was essentially going to sort of symbolize what the war was about. And his speech was just going to be remembered as just sort of this wordy encomium to the dead soldiers that really wasn't that good, and he was kind of a schlub. I kind of think of Edward Everett as kind of like Boss Hogg. Like, can you imagine like Boss Hogg giving that kind of speech? Like this little paunchy guy standing up on a stump, speaking like Huey Long or something like that, even though he was from the North, so I doubt he had a Southern accent, but still, that's how I imagine him like, ladies and gentlemen, let's convene here to discuss Gettysburg and what it all meant, and just giving this long, kind of like a Southern popular speaker. By the way, that wasn't how he sounded because he was from New England, but that's kind of my impression of him. But Edward Everett was a very accomplished guy. I mean, he had served as the governor of Massachusetts. He was president of Harvard. He was the 15th governor of Massachusetts. So he was very accomplished. And he got his PhD at the University of Göttingen in Germany. So he was like one of the first German PhDs and he came back and he wanted to like revolutionize academia. So how do you like that Arnold impersonation? Whenever I talk to him, I always do the Arnold impersonation. But so yeah, he was very well liked and very well respected throughout the United States. He was born April 11th, 1794, died January 15th, 1865. And what we remember about him is that it was the long speech, and then afterwards he came up to Lincoln. He's like, "Gosh, if I'm honored if you said in 2 minutes what I was unable to say in 2 hours." But I reviewed it, and it's good just as a historical source to sort of identify what the stakes were. And here, Edward Everett really does provide some good insight. First off, the first part of the speech is kind of awful. It's not awful, it's kind of good, but basically he goes into the Greek funeral rituals, like the burning pyre and the Battle of Marathon, and how the Greeks would remember their fallen warriors. So it's kind of a lot of, it's kind of just a lot of BS in his first, the windup is about 20 minutes, and I get a little wordy too. So again, he's kind of a guy after my own heart. That's why I'm giving him his due. But what is, and he does have some of these grandiose moments as far as that goes. But let me sort of share some of the highlights of the speech. First, he reminds the members of the audience who had only recently experienced the exhilarating victory of both Vicksburg and Gettysburg on nearly the same date, July 4th of 1863. He reminds the audience what the stakes were if the United States had lost. And they're remembering the brave men that died. For the most part, it was men. I don't believe there were any women fatalities in the Battle of Gettysburg, but the men who died at Gettysburg, what the stakes were. And they were all there and convened to open up the Gettysburg National Cemetery where a lot of the fallen soldiers were buried. He reminds the audience, and we should remember the consequences and how close we were to losing the war. What would have happened if the Battle of Gettysburg would have been lost in the mind of Edward Everett? He said, "For consider, my dear friends, what would have been the consequence to the country, to yourselves, and to all you hold dear, if those who sleep beneath our feet and their gallant comrades who survived to serve their country on other fields of danger had failed in their duty on those memorable days. Consider what at this moment would be the condition of the United States if that noble Army of the Potomac, instead of gallantly and for the second time beating back the tide of invasion from Maryland and Pennsylvania, had been itself driven from these well-contested heights." And here he means the heights at Gettysburg, "thrown back into confusion into Baltimore, or trampled down, discomfited, and scattered to the four winds. What in that sad event would not have been the fate of a monumental city of Harrisburg, of Washington, the capital of the Union, and each and every one which would have lain at the mercy of the enemy, accordingly as it might have pleased him, spurred by passion, flushed with victory, confident of continued success, to direct his course." He's talking about what the stakes were. Had we lost the Battle of Gettysburg, and there were many moments throughout that battle in which the Union could have lost, the Civil War may have been over at that point, because Robert E. Lee understood that the war was as much psychological as it was a war on the battlefield. That is, that there was a lot of Union people in the northern states that did not give a crap about the Union. They were settlers from Europe. There were draft riots in New York, in which a lot of Irish immigrants say, "Why the hell do I want to fight to preserve the Union? I just came here to get land because I was starving in Ireland." There was a lot of regional factions within the United States that wanted to break away themselves. I mean, there were movements in the North. Should the Northwest, the Midwestern states, should they form their own union? Should the Northeast withdraw? Should we become a bunch of city states? I mean, so there was a lot of things that could have happened, and Lee recognized this. Lee thought, just like the generals in Tokyo and the generals in Berlin, that the United States ultimately was a weak country and that it would not be defended, and that if he could persuade the people in the middle that were kind of on the fence that the war would be lost, and not only would the battle be in the South, but it would be brought to the North, to Harrisburg, the capital of Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and potentially to Washington, D.C. That, my friends, that would have been psychologically devastating, because keep in mind who's watching on the sidelines. Britain, Paris, all the European powers. They're kind of wondering, hey, who's going to win this war? And Britain at the time, they needed a lot of the Southern cotton, because what do you think was spinning in those mills in England? And so there was a vested financial interest, but they didn't quite know who was going to win. And a lot of the Southern citizens were in Europe trying to persuade them of that. Just in the way during the Revolutionary War, the United States needed the support of France against Britain to try to win the war. And so he's really reminding us what would have happened had we lost. And he did it very eloquently. It's not as brief and laconic as Abraham Lincoln, but it's sort of a beautiful prose that he does. But then he reminds us of really two of the key war aims of the South that was identified at the outset of the war. Each side sort of knew what they needed to do to win. Keep in mind that there were several slave states that did not withdraw from the Union: Maryland, Kentucky, Delaware, and Missouri. They were literally sitting on the fence of the war. And there was a lot of factions within those states that did want to secede from the Union. And there were a lot of people that thought there were benefits from remaining in the Union. So that if there was a sense on the part of the border states that they were on the losing side, what direction would they go? And Edward Everett reminds us of this. But most importantly, what he recognized is the deep psychological impact of the seizure of Washington, D.C., which was a war aim almost from the start of the war. Because there's nothing more psychologically devastating than holding and seizing the capital of a country. And that's why, in terms of battle, that's why the capital has to be defended at all costs. And up until that point of the war, there's really two ways to do it, right? You could either go directly towards the Civil War, up through Civil War, up to Washington, D.C., through Northern Virginia, or you could try to then distract and withdraw some of those troops away by going to the west of Washington, D.C., which happened in 1862, which was the first invasion of the North, and that was the Battle of Antietam. And so that's essentially one of the other aims of that particular role in Gettysburg was some of those troops, if they were drawn away from Washington, D.C., maybe Washington, D.C. itself was even going to fall. So Edward reminds us of that. Not only would it be psychologically devastating to enter the North, it also possibly could have drawn enough troops away. What would have happened had they won? More troops would have had to have been pulled from other parts of the Union. So this is something also that Lee understood. Lee understood that the war wasn't only one of attrition, but capturing public opinion, because had that battle been lost, potentially a lot of the peace-loving people in the North would have been like, it's just not worth it. And here Edward says that in pursuance of this original plan of the leaders of the rebellion, the capture of Washington has been continually had in view, not merely for the sake of public buildings as the capital of the Confederacy, but as the necessary preliminary to absorption of the border states, and for the moral effect in the eyes of Europe of possessing the metropolis of the Union. So here he's getting at foreign recognition of those particular powers. So he kind of identifies the stakes in the first part of the speech. But then Edward, essentially relying on the notes of a professor, which I believe he identifies as a Professor Jacobs, who was a contemporaneous witness at the Battle of Gettysburg, he essentially gives a day-by-day blow, day 1, day 2, and day 3. This would be July 1st, July 2nd, and July 3rd of 1863. And he gets into great detail relating to that. But one of the other key things, and I don't know if you know much about the Battle of Gettysburg, but one of the really amazing things about that is that the winning Union general, this General Meade, had only been appointed 3 days before the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. So essentially, July 1st of 1863, the battle starts, and General Meade took over on July 28th of 1863, merely 3 days prior to the beginning of the battle. Now, just think about this for a moment. This is a time in which General Halleck, Henry Halleck, and Abe Lincoln, who are two most powerful men in the Union Army at that particular time, Lincoln as commander-in-chief, and Halleck as basically the general of all generals. He was the one that really was organizing the Civil War at that time, know that Lee is invading the North. And at the time, and they know what the stakes are. One, he's either going to sow chaos and confusion, leading to potential European recognition, or he's going to require so many manpower to defeat him, so much manpower to defeat him that maybe even the capital is going to be vulnerable. They understand this. And the general in charge at the time was considered one of the better generals in the United States Army, Joseph Hooker. Hooker was someone who had been defeated by Robert E. Lee in Virginia in early May of 1863. And Hooker is still on the job. He got crushed and basically out-generaled by General Lee, but what the hell do you do if you don't really have any that deep a bench? So as Lee is going into the United States, Hooker knows what's going on and is trying to stop it. And so the question is, how much do you follow Lee? How much do you defend Washington, D.C.? Can you imagine the amount of stress that these leaders must have been under at this point? I mean, we know what the outcome is now, but at the time, imagine if all of a sudden you were invaded and the hostile army was only an hour away. And here's one of the things that makes Abe Lincoln so great. This is why he has absolute brass balls, is that Lincoln makes the decision 3 days. And of course, he didn't know exactly when the battle was going to start, but to appoint General Meade to lead Union forces. And most astonishingly, Meade had no idea that he was going to be appointed. So when he was notified just prior to the hostilities commencing that he was going to be appointed the general of the Army of Potomac, the most important army in the United States military at the time, he wasn't sure whether he was going to get arrested or not. He thought there could be some political infighting or something like that. I said, no, you're not going to be arrested. You're going to be the general of the Army of the Potomac. And here, Edward Everett says, this is just as Lee is invading. He says, in this critical and anxious state of affairs, General Hooker was relieved, and General Meade was summoned to the chief command of the army. It appears to my unmilitary judgment to reflect the highest credit upon him, upon his predecessor, so he's giving credit to Joseph Hooker, and upon the corps commanders of the Army of the Potomac, that a change could take place in the chief command of so large a force on the eve of a general battle. The various corps necessarily moving at the line somewhat divergent, and all in ignorance of the enemy's intended point of concentration. And that not an hour's hesitation should ensue in the advance of any portion of the entire army. So here, they don't know where they're going to go. Are they going to go to Washington? Are they going to go to the north? They didn't know what all the plans were. And at the very eve of this, Lincoln makes a change. And he says, I'm going to put George Meade in charge, and I'm going to relieve Hooker. Now, that could be an entire other podcast. But my sense is, knowing Lincoln, and I'm not a Lincoln scholar, but I think basically the issue with Hooker was the issue with all the other previous generals, is that he was always complaining about the resources that he wasn't given, always complaining about he couldn't do this, he couldn't do that. He was indecisive. He was sort of a career general. And Lincoln did not like that. He did not like people complain. And one of the reasons why he loved U.S. Grant, I've been on a podcast on U.S. Grant, my major man crush, is that Grant did what the best he could with the resources that he was given. And he never complained. He always accepted responsibility. And I think Meade was a little bit similar to that too. Once Grant was in charge in 1864 of all Union forces, Meade offered his resignation, but Grant didn't accept it because I think Meade had a lot of those same qualities of humility, coolness under fire. I mean, he must have. Just imagine taking over. It'd be like someone taking over as head coach 3 days before the Super Bowl. What kind of impact that might have had. But it's also interesting in the sense that Edward uses the word relieved. He wasn't really relieved. He had tendered his resignation to Halleck and Lincoln, and they accepted it July 28th of 1863. So that's just astonishing. And then here he gets into just the actual battle itself. And I'm not going to recount all of that, but there were various moments in which easily the North could have lost, and we could have lost the Union. And then he has some good kernels of some good lines in here. You know, it's a 2-hour speech, and we kind of give it a short thrift. But there are some good lines here. So he talks about after the conflict, he said how amazing it was that the Union actually won. He said the superiority of numbers was with the enemy, who were led by the ablest commanders in their service. And if the Union force had the advantage of a strong position, the Confederates had that of choosing time and place. The prestige of former victories of the Army of the Potomac and of the success of the first day. And then here's the good line. He said, victory does not always fall to the lot of those who deserve it. But that so decisive a triumph under circumstances like these was gained by our troops, I would ascribe under Providence to the spirit of exalted patriotism that animated them, and a consciousness that they were fighting in a righteous cause. That's the other thing to remember. On the first day, basically, the Union was driven back on their heels. So they were in retreat. And it was only that second day where the Union regained its footing. The third day, there was additional fighting, but by that time, the South had essentially just lost too many men. So there were some good lines that Edward Everett had in this particular speech that he gave at Gettysburg. And then having recounted, so he basically sets the stage for why Gettysburg was so important. Everett then sort of talks a little bit about what he talks about. He has some good lines here. Wretched sophistries. I mean, so here he's talking about the South had all these crazy demands and crazy theories as to why they were justified in doing what they did. Constitutional theories, legal theories. And Edward does a good job of just sort of dispatching with these, that they're basically total bullshit. But then he also talks and he appeals to the peaceniks, because at the time and basically throughout the war, there were a lot of people in the North that wanted to sue for peace. And these guys were known as the Copperheads. These were the guys that wanted to sue for peace and to restore the Union through negotiated settlement. And they were also known as the Peace Democrats. One of the most famous Copperheads would have been George McClellan, who ran for president in 1864. He was the general who had been fired by Abe Lincoln because he really wasn't very successful, 1861, 1862, that time period. But that essentially is who Edward is appealing to, are these peaceniks. Why can't we just do a negotiated settlement? And one of the argument of a negotiated peace is, or to cease hostilities is, well, hey, you know what? We can't ever have peace with these guys. And what are the stakes here in terms of peace? But here's one of the things that I think Edward reminds at us. If we yield into the demands of the Southern leaders, what happens to those parts of the South that are already occupied by the Union? At that point, he really realizes this is in the South. Whole parts of the Union were already occupied. The South were already occupied by the Union. What's going to happen to them? And he says, what about all these other sacrifices he's named? Not only the cessation to them of a foreign and hostile power of all the territory of the United States at present occupied by metal forces, but the abandonment to them of what Everett says are vast regions which we have rescued from their grasp, of Maryland, of Eastern Virginia, and the whole of Western Virginia, the seacoast of North and South Carolina, Georgia and Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, Missouri, Arkansas, and a larger portion of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. most of which, with the exception of lawless guerrillas, there is not a rebel in arms, in all of which a great majority of the people are loyal to the Union. So that's really key. He's saying, what's going to happen to them? I mean, are we just going to turn them over? At that point, he's really saying there is no compromise with the enemy. It's either them or it's either us. And this is the thing that Lincoln emphasized: when the house divided against itself cannot stand. You cannot have a hostile power right next to your doorstep. It just doesn't work in the long term. And had there been peace, quote unquote peace, inevitably, and there'd have been a separate nation down there in the South, eventually it would have been resulted in hostilities one way or another, because they were just two completely different cultures. But here, and I think this is probably the best part of the speech, and this is probably, I think, the most eloquent part of the speech, is that he says, what happens to the enslaved people of color that had been fighting for the Union, the ones who had been freed? What is going to happen to them? And I think this is probably the best part of the speech, this particular line from Edward's speech. He says, finally, if we have peace, the South, what it will inevitably mean, and here's the direct quote: finally, we must surrender every man in the Southern country, white or black, who has moved a finger or spoken a word for the restoration of the Union, to a reign of terror as remorseless as that of Robespierre, which has been the chief instrument by which the rebellion has been organized and sustained, and which has already filled the prisons of South with noble men, whose only crime is that they are not the worst of criminals. When he says the South is full of such men, and I believe there has not been a day since the election of President Lincoln when, if an ordinance succession had been fairly submitted after a free discussion to the mass of people in any single state, a majority of ballots would have been given of its favor. So there he's saying that, that it was just a small cabal of people who had organized this rebellion, and that it was based upon sheer terror. And that is something that I think he's absolutely right on, that it really was going to be this war of terror that would have been as bad as Robespierre, and in particular, the people of color. So that is another really good part of this particular speech by Edward Everett. And then as he gets close to the end, and people have been listening to the speech for almost 2 hours, and if you've been listening this far, you're kind of like, oh my gosh, this is just like the Edward Everett speech. But he addresses one really good point, and I think this is relevant in your own life, which is really the power of forgiveness. Is that even going to be possible? I mean, so here, Edward Everett is looking to what happens if we are able to win completely. Can we really coexist with these people that have raised arms against us? And here, I think he's channeling a little bit of Christianity, which is one of the things I love about Christianity, is he's talking about really the power of forgiveness. And this is something that I think whenever you have a conflict with someone, no matter how bad it is, forgiveness is always possible. And then Everett, as wordy as he is, he goes back to past conflicts, both in England and Germany. He talks about the War of the Roses. He talks about the English Civil War that was vicious and violent, in which for a while the King of England was beheaded, and eventually the monarchy was restored. He said that they were able to peacefully coexist. He talks about the battles in Germany, in which there were wars there as well, in which the parties eventually were able to peacefully coexist. And so then he talks about Italy. I mean, after the fall of the Roman Empire, all of these particular little municipalities ended up fighting one another for a long period of time. At the time of the Civil War, there was a very strong movement, and it becomes so bad that it was essentially, Everett calls Italy, after the fall of the Roman Empire, as essentially noble families and walled towns fell madly into conflict with each other. The secular feud of Pope and Emperor scourged the land, province against province, city against city, street against street, waged remorseless war with each other from father to son, till Dante was able to fill this imaginary hell with the real demons of Italian history. And even though it was that bad, at that time when the speech was given, there was a movement within Italy to unite Italy into one nation. And so he's saying, As bad as the Civil War has been, it is possible to have peace, and that forgiveness is possible, and that we can see, as Lincoln said, the better angels of our nature. So that was, I think, a really good line of it as well. And then finally, he gets grandiose here in his last paragraph, and I'll just quote a few of his better sentences there. He says, after having listened for 2 hours, and if you're here still, by the way, good for you. This is how I'm honoring Edward Everett, by giving a really long podcast. But he says, you now feel it a new bond of union, and they shall lie side by side. This is referring to the victims who fell and the men who fought. That they shall lie side by side till a clarion louder than which marshaled them to combat shall awake their slumbers. God bless the Union. It is dear to us for the blood of the brave men which have been shed in its defense. And then he concludes, all time, he might have added, as the millennium of their glory. Surely I would do no injustice to the noble achievements of the war, which have been reflected such honor on both arms of the service, and have entitled the armies and the Navy of the United States and their officers and the men to the warmest thanks and richest rewards which a grateful people can pay. But they, I am sure, will join us in saying, as we bid farewell to the dust of these martyred heroes, that wheresoever throughout the civilized world the accounts of this great warfare are read, and down to the latest period of recorded time, in the glorious annals of our common country, there will be no brighter page than that which relates to the battles of Gettysburg. So here he's putting it in the great battles of all time. The Battle of Waterloo, the Battle of Yorktown, he doesn't mention that. The Battle of Thermopylae, the Spartans, all of the great battles, he's saying this was that kind of battle. The kind of battle in which the tides of history actually changed. And had that battle been lost, and had those soldiers not fought, we could be living in a current situation in which the southern part of the United States, at least, was a place where half the country, a substantial portion of the population were enslaved and not free. It could have been continual chaos and conflict, but it wasn't because of what happened at Gettysburg. And Edward Everett, who has been passed throughout history, did a pretty good job of this speech. I encourage you to read it. It gives you kind of a little bit of a Greek history. It gives you sort of some interesting nuggets leading up to the battle, a description of the battle itself via Professor Jacobs. And he identifies kind of a little bit of English history, a little German history, and then he talks about how important it was for the Union. And so it is worth reading. If you want to take a look at it, read it. It's available online, super easy to find. And Edward, you did a good job. Certainly no Abe Lincoln. But I think because we're celebrating Abe Lincoln, I'm also going to read the Gettysburg Address, which is 2 minutes as opposed to the 2 hours. And here is where Lincoln, along with Mark Twain, really created the modern English language, whereas before Edward Everett, this would be the standard example of the type of oratory that was used. And Lincoln distilled, one of the qualities of a lawyer that makes a lawyer successful is the ability to understand what matters, number one, that's called materiality, and two, important when you're talking to a jury, why it matters. It's very in distilling what the important parts are and what the unimportant parts are. And this is really what Lincoln had developed as a skill from countless pleadings and countless arguments to the jury. And just a skill as a lawyer is to decide what matters, number one, and why it matters, number two. So here I will read the Gettysburg Address by Abraham Lincoln. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives, that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work, which they who have fought have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now, that is one of the best speeches of the 20th century. And whole classes, whole books have been written about it, but it answered the most important question, which is, why are we fighting? And there could not have been a greater explanation to remind the country, because this is still in the middle of the war when it was not over, why so many men had to die for a purpose, that they have not died in vain. So that kind of stands on its own. And I wanted to juxtapose it with Edward Everett. I wanted to give Edward his due. You know, if you're still here and you listen to this whole podcast, tons of gratitude to you. Because it was a longer one. You know, some people say that my podcasts are a little bit wordy, a little bit long. But this is something that I really wanted to explore because I think there were some good nuggets with Edward Everett. And I think also to juxtapose it with this 2-hour speech with Lincoln. But I wanted to do it in a way in which we actually gave Edward his due, because he was one of the great speakers of the 19th century. And there are some good parts of it. So I do encourage you to read it. But of course, too, you know, it used to be in our common educational tradition, we would remember the Gettysburg Address. And maybe that's something you could do as well. But I think that's something that we should continually read so we can celebrate this great nation of ours. And you know, patriotism is something that I think too many libs kind of distort it. You know, I think it's bad to celebrate the country, but I don't think any country can really exist in which, unless it's really bound by essentially a common heritage or a common thread that unites the country. That is the portion of the reason for a state, which, as Everett reminds us, are 4 great things: a substantial community of origin, language, belief, and law. And he says, these are the 4 great ties that hold the societies of men together: common national political interests, a common history, a common pride, and a glorious ancestry, common interest in the great heritage, the very geographical features of the country, the mighty rivers that cross the lines of climate, and thus facilitate the exchange of industrial products. And while the wonder-working arm of the engineer has leveled the mountain walls which shall separate the east and west, compelling your own Alleghenies, my Maryland and Pennsylvania friends, to open wide their everlasting doors to the chariot wheels of traffic and travel. These bonds of union are a perennial force and energy, while the claws of alienation are imaginary, fractious, and transient. So, friends, infinite gratitude to each and every one of you who has tuned in this far. You know, there are a cacophony of voices out there on the internet with podcasts, and the fact that you have spent this time with me, I'm very grateful for that. I am now starting to do listener support. So if you've enjoyed this podcast, you want to contribute 99 cents or $5 a month, I do have a link in the show notes where you can do that. I do hope you continue to spread the word. The podcast is growing in numbers, although we're still kind of a small, tiny but mighty podcast. We have a continuing growing audience, but it doesn't grow unless you share that you like it. You tell your friends about it. You know, this episode might bomb. My first one on Abe Lincoln kind of bombed, I hate to admit. You guys seem to like my fasting episodes the most, but continue to reach out to me. rocknecole@gmail.com or rocknecast@gmail.com. So I can talk about ideas, parts you like about the podcast, ways that I can improve it, because I think this is sort of a shared product between you and me. I really enjoy doing the podcast. It's very therapeutic to me. It means a lot to me that you've made it this far. We're going to continue to put on high quality content. I'm going to be sharing my podcast with Clemens Erdahl, a good friend and mentor of mine. And so all of these things are things we're going to be continuing to put on in this podcast. So that concludes this episode of the RockneCast. Happy President's Day, in which we celebrated Abraham Lincoln and Edward Everett. And we're finally giving Edward Everett his due. Thank you so much. Until next time on the RockneCast.